Have you all ever had that moment where you're in a kind of lunchroom, or maybe it's like the first time you've been at a work or someplace like that, and you've got your food and you all have, at least for me, I always have that same fear. Who can I sit with? Who's going to be nice to me? Who's going to be present to what's happening, right? Like that fear, and I still remember as a second grader, like we'd just moved into the school, I didn't know any of the other kids, and there were like two second grade tables, and I went and I just sat by myself. No one else, just sat there and just started eating my food and sort of my own sadness and my own everything like that. And then apparently somebody had talked and said, well, clearly he's too afraid to come to us. So this whole side of a table got up, moved, and came over and sat down across from me. Right? That sort of generosity of spirit, that incredible noticing that I didn't have it within me to be the one brave enough to go do that thing. How often is coming into church kind of like that? Where we have our own script, our own memory, our own idea of what other people are seeing in us, and we begin to sort of judge people by the way that we think they're judging us. Oh, they're going to know I'm here by myself. Or they're going to know that I'm not entirely holy. Or they're going to know that I'm somehow, less than or imperfect or somehow different. Right? How many of us walk into this place feeling like we are a puzzle piece from the wrong puzzle? And that moment in which we just sort of sit down and are terrified that somebody might find out this weird and not secret that we all think we have, that we're wonderfully, happily human. Flawed, broken, less than in so many ways, and yet we sort of always seem to want to come into a place like this as though we can somehow hide it, right? As though somehow we can, under our cloak or some other way, hide this reality that we are wonderfully and perfectly human. And it's today's readings that give us the key to get outside of that mindset. Because if we were just asked to be nice to one another, if we were asked to even love our neighbor as ourselves without that first commandment, without the commandment to love God above all things, it would be like building a house on straw. It'd be like hoping for a rainstorm in the desert. It'd be sort of futile. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it'll work, but it's not built on any solid foundation. In today's first reading, we hear from the book of Deuteronomy, that great prayer, that great Israelite prayer. To be an Israelite means one who wrestles with God, one who is wrestling with God, and God says with no uncertainty that, "Hear, O Lord," listen, right? "Hear, O Lord, to love your God, your Lord, who is only yours with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul." This is the first and the greatest commandment, Jesus says. It's a great prayer of that Israelite history, a great prayer of recognizing where our honor goes and where our strength comes from. Because if we do not anchor ourselves in a love that is beyond anything we humans can do, we're going to be burnt out before the sun sets. Because to love our neighbor, and truly I want you to know that when we begin this liturgy, that we love you wherever you are at, we are grateful that you are here, we mean that. Whether you have been coming to St. Thomas More long before it was ever called that, I know there was another name, I'm not going to say it right now. It's a joke, it was St. Luke's. Maybe you've been here just a week, or maybe you're just visiting. Maybe you're unsure about this whole Catholic Church thing, or maybe you are solid in your faith, but truly, wherever you are at, we want to welcome you. And it's not just because we're nice. It's because if we want to see the face of God as God truly is, if we want to see this God that we can love, we can only get small glimpses of it by getting all of you together and seeing that God in each and every one of you. A God who comes through in these brilliant moments of generosity, of joy, of laughter, of high fives and fist bumps. A God who is just waiting to explode out of you as you share that love with the world. And it does not matter to us where you are on that journey. Because by being here, you make us holy. I don't make us holy. I mean, if it was all on me to be the holy one, we'd be in trouble, y'all. You know, if it was all on me to sort of like lead a congregation to do anything, and God help us, I know that Father Warren let it out of the cat out of the bag last week that I'm probably going to get a new job here in a little less than a year. And I would be more terrified than I actually am if I thought it was all about what I had to do. It's not. Your presence, your generosity, your love and gift of self is what makes this place holy and this community alive. And it isn't just based on each one of you individually. It is about that corporate good in which we orient our hearts to worship. The invitation today is to worship God, not simply be entertained, not simply just to be here because it's cool or people are nice, but because by turning our hearts over to God in the act of worship, we ourselves are transformed and we transform one another. This cannot happen in isolation. Piety, prayerfulness, and even really good and holy people happen, but they are never isolated. Even the sort of Carthusian religious order, which is perhaps the most austere and separated religious order of all of the orders in the Catholic Church, they only talk to each other once a week. Now, I know there's some families in here who would like to institute that rule, but that's not what I'm talking about. Right? That they gather in their cells every day to do prayer, and it's a really monastic, almost hermit style of living. It's incredibly isolating, and yet they still do it in community. They still have time to gather and to worship together. They still, in their sort of individual cells, make up a monastery, a group of people whose hearts are being oriented towards the worship of the one true God. And throughout our history, this has been the invitation to each of us, regardless of how we come into this cafe table, right? It is not a lunchroom in which we have to worry about where we sit. It is a welcoming place in which we invite all people because that is what God has done throughout history. Now, some of that means that we have to reorient our hearts, and that can be sometimes a frustrating, painful process. You know, even the ancient Israelites had to have their hearts reconditioned to be part of this great covenant. You know, if we think about the plagues that were sent during the Exodus story, they were not just random plagues, actually. They were plagues in which God demonstrated God's power over all the false gods that existed in Egypt. Right, so the first plague of turning the Nile into blood, well, the Nile was worshipped as a god unto itself. And so God, the God of Israel, the one to whom we owe our love and our hearts, says, nope, I got that. I control even that. Believe it or not, there was a god of frogs, which is why the frogs are thrown out, right? Like, there's all of these different gods in our hearts, and in the 21st century, we probably don't worship a river, we probably don't worship frogs, but there are other things in our lives that we've come to worship. Money, fame, renowned, some other thing that can distract our hearts from the very thing that deserves all of our worship. And if we try to do that by ourselves, I think we're still on a pretty bland task. Because it is only in this community in which we see each other working and trying to strive towards that holiness, in which I can witness God in each of you, in which we can witness God in each other, in which we can sort of participate because we know we are on the road together, not because we are perfect, not because we have the right sort of puzzle piece in this moment, but because we are imperfect, because each of us carry a moment in which we're not entirely sure we belong, and it is by surrendering that to God that we realize how silly that really is. Because it is not about belonging because we have the same style, or that we all believe the same things, or that we always agree with each other. We know that that's not true. We belong because we have a God who loves us first, a God who reaches into human history and gives us his very self in his Son for our sanctification, for our salvation. Today, to love God with all of our heart, with all of our mind, and all of our soul is to begin by being welcoming, by recognizing the very source of that love is a source beyond any one of us individually. To love God with all of our heart, with all of our mind, and with our very understanding, as the scribe says, is to turn our attention to the one who loved us first. And so, my friends, we worship today, not because anyone here is perfect, far from it. We worship today because where we begin is more than good enough.